Hey everyone, it's Nightharo here, and today I've got a 1-bar Nightblade build guide for you. This is a Magicka Nightblade. As always, everything is timestamped below, so feel free to go ahead and skip ahead. I'm going to talk here first about why you might want to use a 1-bar build and why you might want to choose a Nightblade, and then we'll kind of go on to skills and everything else. So if you're already sold on the idea, feel free to go ahead and skip ahead. So why play a Nightblade? Well, Nightblades have a lot of survivability, Magblades in particular, I'm sorry, not just all Nightblades, but Magblades in particular have a lot of survivability. One of your main spambles can heal you for a significant amount. You have easy access to both major and minor expedition for a lot of speed. They do a lot of direct damage, which can be really useful when you're running around overland and mobs are bothering you, trying to do quests and stuff like that. Couple of hits of a spammable and literally everything will die. And that can be a little bit more fun than like a necro where you're often putting down a bunch of dots and you kind of have to wait for the dots to go off while you hit a couple of spambles to eventually get mobs to die. Another thing is the Dark Brotherhood and Thieves Guild skill lines. They're really fun. I highly recommend them. I've got a guide on how to make like a rogue Nightblade to run around and do those quests and to also make money stealing. You can actually make, easily 40K in 20, 30 minutes, which is a really great way for new people to make money. It can be kind of fun. You can also get certain motifs and other things that can only be gotten that way or can only be reliably gotten that way. So that can be kind of nice. You can do the Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood quest lines on other classes, but it's just going to be 1,000 times easier and cheaper on a Nightblade because you have the skills that you need. Now, why might you not want to play a Nightblade? Because I think that's important as well. Well, Nightblades are probably the hardest class in the game to parse on. And that is because their rotation is very complex. There have been recently some easier stamina Nightblade iterations where you could use your spam ball a lot more, but historically and still even for this build, you're going to be using a 6-button rotation with this, and a 2-bar Sork has a 6-button rotation, so it's pretty much just as hard as a 2-bar Sork. So these things are not really balanced. It is kind of a bummer that they don't do more damage if you can achieve like the optimal parse and an optimal rotation, but unfortunately that is not the case. You're going to be right up there with everybody else, but you're not going to be parsing any higher. And, that's something I wish Zos would fix. Maybe Gilliam would help us out. For those of you who don't know, Gilliam works for Zos now, but he used to make content on ESO, and you can still find his videos on YouTube. All right, well, I think that's enough about why you might want to play a Nightblade. Let's talk about 1-bar builds. Each class kind of has its own thing that you need to understand about how to parse with it to get maximum damage. So for a Necromancer, you need to realize that your Blast Bones, you need to cast that every 3rd skill. So 1 skill, 2 skills, and then Blast Bones. And you need to do that rotation to get maximum DPS out of a Necromancer. For something like a Warden, it's your shocks. You kind of have a semi-spamble with your shocks. You need to make sure that's up all the time. If you're using a Frost Warden, you want to make sure that you are using your spammable fairly consistently while still keeping up all your dots. And that can be, something that's easier to do. Both those things are easier to learn on a 1-bar build. So for a Nightblade, it's kind of the same deal here. The thing that separates a Nightblade is going to be these 3 skills in the middle here. So one of these is going to be our spammable, and then the other one is going to be our execute. So once we hit 25% on this build with the Magicka Morph, we are going to want to switch from our normal spammable to our execute spammable. And that will just help our DPS go up considerably. The other thing with a Nightblade is that it's very important to be able to light attack weave, because we use this Merciless Resolve here to get a Spectral Bow proc, often just referred to as a bow proc. You'll hear me say that. But what that means is that every 5 skills, this increases your weapon and spell damage for each stack. At 5 stacks, you can hit that to shoot out and do a bunch of damage with 1 attack. And that is very important. We want to be using this skill every time it's up. And so it's very important, though, that we build those stacks by light attack weaving properly. So the thing with a Nightblade is that you really want to focus on light attack weaving. So that can be a really useful thing for learning a Nightblade, is because you'll have to learn how to light attack, and you'll be able to see every single time you miss, because the number on our Merciless Resolve will not go up. And we realize, oh, I missed a light attack there. So it's kind of the difficult and rewarding thing about a Nightblade. And so when you think about it, a lot of people will say, just start people with a 2-bar build. They don't need to learn a 1-bar build. And basically it's like, people should run before they can walk. At least that's my take on it. And I've changed my mind over the last couple of months. I actually think now more than ever that a 1-bar build is a really great place for a new person to start. And the comments that I've gotten from friends, who some of them are very casual players and have been for a very long time, is that after a while they get bored with a 1-bar build, or they get bored with other builds that they've been shown own, and they want something that is more fun, that has more flexibility, has more spaces to be able to, put on different skills and still be able to keep really good damage. And I think that's a fairly natural progression. I think that's okay. Asking someone to use twice as many skills just when they start off with for 30% extra damage doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think it's much better to start with something simple if your one bar build does that. There are a lot of really bad one bar builds out there, and I think they've kind of given them a bad name. So with the Nightblade, with this one bar build, you really want to practice with light attack weaving and then using our bow procs, our merciless resolve, every 5 casts that we're light attacking, and then making sure we use our execute spammable in execute. And those are things that even when you get to a 2-bar build are going to be just the same. You're just going to have more dots that you need to keep up. And so again, I think this is a really great place to learn. And then once you get comfortable and you're doing your light attack weaving well, and you're using merciless resolve every 5 casts, and then you're using your execute well, then you add in some more dots, and it's not nearly as much of a lift as going straight into it. But again, you are going to be limited. There's not going to be nearly as many spots to put on healing abilities and other utility abilities. And if you do that, you're going to lose more damage than you would on a 2-bar build. So those are kind of the downsides to it. All right, enough of a preamble. Let's go ahead and talk about these skills. So first up here is our Path of Darkness. This is a skill we want to generally try to keep up 100% of the time. It lasts for 12 seconds, and that's going to be paired with one of our potential spambles, which is Concealed Weapon. But we want to make sure we have refreshing up pretty much all the time. It does good damage. It also provides us and everyone inside of the path Major Expedition, which increases our speed by 30%. This can be really helpful for overland if you're just trying to run around, and it can also be helpful for solo content when you're trying to kite enemies and stuff like that. And actually, I say that it can be helpful in group content as well. So Zalvaka, trying to get up the stairs. There's a lot of places where having speed is really helpful, and this skill does really good damage for us, and it's something we always want on our bar no matter what. So at least in the current meta. So it's just a really nice skill to have, and you just pretty much will always have it on your bar. And it's one of those things I think is overlooked. Being able to provide Major Expedition for your group can be really helpful. Next up here is our spammable, and our execute spammable rather. And the reason we're using this is because it does so much more damage in execute, and it really takes the place of our normal execute. It also, just from being on our bar, provides us some extra crit chance just from passives from that skill line. But the main thing is when we hit 25%, we're going to switch and be using this as our spammable. We'll talk about these flex skills here in a second. And then after that, we have our Concealed Weapon. So Concealed Weapon is our Magicka morph of this ability. It is our spammable, what we're going to be using most of the time. I will note a couple of things about this. So one, it gives us Minor Expedition just being on our bar. So that's an extra 15%, and the Major Expedition is another 30%. So this build, we have increased 45% speed just passively, kind of playing the class like normal. So that's pretty cool. Let you move around, do solo kind of content. If you're in group content doing portals and stuff like that, Nightblades can be really good for that kind of thing. The other thing about it is that our Concealed Weapon gives us an extra 10% damage while we're standing in our path and for several seconds after leaving it. That 10% increase in damage is huge. So even when we want a ranged spammable, we're going to leave this skill on our bar just for that passive, for that extra 10% damage, because that's a huge increase. If you think about 5-piece sets, the absolute max you can typically get from them is like a 15% damage increase. So just having one skill on our bar is 2/3 of a 5-piece set. Kind of one way of thinking about it, I guess. So it's pretty significant. It's also important to note that if you hit an enemy from behind, you will set them off balance. This can be really useful both for yourself, but mostly in group content where you can be a person who provides off balance for the group. Now, typically groups are like, they should have a wall of elements down, a lightning wall, and that'll set them off balance and stuff like that. In theory, yes, that's true. In practice, I find myself seeing off balance procced a fair amount by having this skill and using it on my bar. Next up is our Merciless Resolve. So we only have to cast this every 40 seconds or so, and then the idea is that every time we light attack, we get a stack of it, which increases our weapon and spell damage, and then once we get to 5 stacks, you can actually use the bow proc. I will note when you're at 4 stacks, you can light attack weave before you cast this skill, get a 5th stack as long as you're in melee, and then go ahead and use the bow proc. It's a little bit tricky to do it first, and sometimes, hopefully I'll have some parses here I can show you where I've messed up doing that, but that can be something you can do and will increase your DPS. If you've got a lot of latency, you've got a lot of issues, just wait until you get a full 5, go ahead and light attack before this a 6th time, and then cast the skill, and it's not going to be that big of a deal. You're not going to lose too much damage. The other thing is, while we use this skill in melee, we heal for the half the damage caused. This can routinely proc in group content for like over 100k, so just realize this is going to heal you up to full and can be something really useful. Sometimes when you're doing portal mechanics, or if you're doing stuff solo, I will leave this procced if I know I'm going to need a big heal. And then, you take a bunch of damage and the mechanic's coming, you hit your bow proc and you're basically healed up to full. And that works for group content, that works for solo content, any kind of portal content. As long as you're in melee, it's going to heal you, and it'll pretty much give you a full health bar. Again, the Nightblade is very survivable, but it is tricky to be able to use them properly, or at least to the best of their ability. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And then our next skill here is going to be our Barb Trap. So this skill is from the Fighters Guild skill line, and it gives us minor force, which increases our critical damage by 10%. Increased critical damage is something you pretty much always want on every build, this minor force buff, no matter what you're doing, and Barb Trap does pretty good damage as well, so that's why we want it. I would note if you need the ranged version of this, because you want a full range build, you can just remorph it to Lightweight Beast Trap, which is the other morph. It does a little bit less damage, but not that much, and it's going to work just fine. It will still provide us with that minor force. Also, just having this on our bar gives us, from some passives in the Fighters Guild skill line, the Slayer passive will increase our weapon and spell damage. So, it does really good damage, just like a normal spammable. It gives us that minor force that we absolutely want, because that increases our damage by about 5 to 8% on this build. And then it also gives us the increased weapon and spell damage. So it's just a really great skill and something you generally want to use. You can use channeled acceleration. I see that on a lot of builds. Generally, you don't want to do that. If you can at all proc Barb Trap and you're actually in any kind of optimal content, you'll want to use Barb Trap. You want to use channeled acceleration in certain situations where you can pre-buff it and things like that. But I see it on a lot of builds, and Barb Trap is much better. It does all the things that I just mentioned, where channeled acceleration only gives you the minor force, and even then it's channeled and it takes a while to go off, and Barb Trap is just a much better skill. Now, if we want a ranged spammable, we are going to need to swap out something here on our bar. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. When you eventually you get to the point where you want more skills, more abilities on your bar, you're comfortable with these first 5, and you'll need to swap something out. So let's go ahead and talk about that now. So first thing, I'm kind of starting on the right side, I know, but let's start with Swallow Soul. So we've got to put this somewhere. We don't want to replace Concealed Weapon because it gives us 10% damage for being on our bar with our Path of Darkness. So we don't want to take that off, because even though we're losing Barb Trap, we're still losing more than we're gaining. We don't want to change out our Execute spammable, kind of the same situation. We don't want to change out Merciless Resolve. That's another way to get a lot of healing, so it kind of doesn't make sense to swap out a healing or a range skill for something like that. We're going to lose too much damage. So we kind of have to swap out Barb Trap here. So that is kind of unfortunate. We are going to lose about 5 to 8% damage just by swapping out this one skill. Now, honestly, normally what I do is I would put this where the Concealed Weapon is, and then I would move Concealed Weapon to the end of my bar. That's just how I like my bars set up. I like 3 being my spammable, but you can do whatever you want. The main thing is just swap out Barb Trap and put on Swallow Soul. And this is just going to be, and again, we just use this as our normal spammable. It is ranged. It gives us a huge heal over time. And when we crit with our damage, the heal also gets the crit, because it's based on how much damage we do. So really crazy, really good skill. And, when you're in content and you're dying or you really need heals, you just spam this for heals, because otherwise it ticks every 2 seconds, but it ticks right after you do damage. So you can keep spamming it and you'll get heals every second instead of every 2 seconds. And in a lot of situations, once you get used to content, you can actually get by with just Swallow Soul and Merciless Resolve and not slotting any other kind of heal. And so that makes you really strong in Portal, doing kind of Portal mechanics, because you don't need to replace a DPS skill with a healing skill. You can just go with your normal build. Now, you might be in a situation, certainly when you're just starting out, where you need more heals, and that's totally understandable. And so you got to swap something out. Again, we only have 1 bar, so what are we going to do here? What I would recommend is swapping out your Execute. I don't like doing this. It doesn't feel great doing it, but we got to swap out something, and I think this makes the most sense. So I would suggest swapping out your Execute and putting on Shrewd Offering. I believe this is the Malevolent Offering, the picture I have here. Both versions are fine. Healthy Offering gives you a little bit extra healing. Shrewd Offering costs less, and so I think for solo content, when you're probably going to need this, that's the best thing to do, is to go with Shrewd Offering. I will note that this skill scares a lot of people, because they look at it and they're like, oh no, it costs health. That ends up not being a big deal in the grand scheme of things, because the heal is going to scale off of your weapon and spell damage, but the damage you take is set. That doesn't scale at all. So it ends up being only it makes the heal 10% as effective. And it's a damage over time. So you get a big burst and then you take a little bit of damage. Note that if you have Swallow Soul, and you should be using Swallow Soul if you're using Malevolent Offering. If you're using Swallow Soul, that heal over time is going to more than make up for it. And then kind of the other situation that I think you might be in, certainly if you're running around overland or you're grinding something out with AoEs, you can swap out your execute for sap essence. And this is a really great skill. It does direct damage and it heals you and then does more based on however many enemies it hits. This basically does the same damage as Swallow Soul or pretty close to it. However, it does it in an AoE centered around you. So this is also can be something that if you're in an AoE fight, you could swap this out and use that as your spammable. I will note that it costs enough magicka that you will run out. You're not going to be able to sustain this even in an optimized group combat situation, which kind of makes sense. You know, it does as much as your normal spammable, but it's in an AoE, it probably should cost more. But that's a really great skill. When I'm running around overland, Sap Essence is one that I often use because I can just hit a couple times, kill everything around me, and then I'm good to go. All right, and now for our ultimate. So Nightblades are a little bit different than other classes. This is kind of what I was telling you about. You have a 6-button rotation. Basically, every second full rotation of your bar, well, at least on a 2-bar build, you're going to have enough ultimate to cast our incapacitating strikes. Now, this only costs 70 ultimate, and what it does, in addition to just doing a lot of damage, similar, honestly comparable to our Merciless Resolve, our bow procs, but it also increases the enemy's damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds. So the idea here is that we kind of keep up all of our dots, we get the ultimate for our incapacitating strikes, we use that skill, and then after that, we have 6 seconds where we just use our spamble and our bow procs to get as much damage as we can. This is very important for a Nightblade, and one of the reasons I said it's so complex, you know, you don't want to really be refreshing dots while this skill is active. You want to either do that before or just go ahead and let them tick off for a few seconds. If you are running solo content or doing some kind of AoE grind, I recommend using Soul Harvest instead. The reason for that is because Incapacitating Strikes gives you magicka and stamina back every time you light attack an opponent. However, Soul Harvest gives you ultimate every time you kill an opponent. Now, you do have to get the killing blow for that to proc, so that's why it's not good in group content, because there's 8 to 12 other people that could be, or 8 to 11 other people that could be, you know, getting the killing blow. It could even be the tank if they have a wall of elements down. Even though you're doing most of the damage, it could be that you don't get credit. So Soul Harvest, a little bit better in smaller group content or just solo content, and then Incapacitating Strikes helps your sustain a lot, so that's why I recommend it for group content. And that definitely synergizes better with a 2-bar build where you can have the Soul Harvest on your front bar and then you have like an AoE ultimate on your back bar, and that way you can generate ultimate on your front bar with killing things, and then you can use an AoE ult because you're obviously in an AoE situation if you are using Soul Harvest. Another note here, Nightblades have a passive called Catalyst, and this is from the siphoning skill line, and what it does is every time you drink a potion, you gain 20 ultimate. And to be able to parse to full effect on a Nightblade, you need to manage that, which is a little bit crazy because you already have a 6-button rotation because you're casting Incapacitating Strikes so often, and now you also need to manage when you drink your potions. So generally speaking, you want your potion buffs to be up all the time, so you just kind of drink on cooldown. And if you're new and you're beginning, absolutely do that, but just realize that if you're close to getting enough ultimate for an Incapacitating Strikes, but your potion is also almost up, it's better to use your Incapacitating Strikes, takes all your ultimate away, and then drink a potion, and that gives you 20 ultimate back, and you're already a third of the way to being able to cast that skill again. So again, that's why Nightblades can be so tricky and so challenging to play, is just because their rotation, to use it optimally, is extremely difficult. Now, the other option here is an AoE ability, and that is Soul Tether. And the reason I like this skill is because it does kind of comparable to what a Destro ult would do based on, you know, how much ultimate it takes to do that damage. They're in the same ballpark, but this you can cast a lot more often. It's also from the class skill line, which can be nice, and anybody can use it. The other thing is that this also heals you in addition. So this is really great for solo content. If you're grinding, doing any kind of AoE thing, Soul Tether will kind of keep you alive and keep you from dying for a few seconds at least after you cast it. It also stuns all those enemies. So again, if you're on trash or ads that can be stunned, casting Soul Tether will stun them, do a bunch of damage, heal you back up to full health, and it's just kind of like a get out of jail free card. So it's Soul Tether, great skill. It does take like a half a second or a second to go off, so do keep that in mind. You'll hit the button, it is channeled, and then it'll go off. But that's a great AoE option. Again, as I mentioned with the Soul Harvest, it's better to have like Soul Tether on your back bar, Soul Harvest in front bar, generate a bunch of ult, AoE them down, back to the front bar, and again, that's what you gain. That's kind of stuff you gain from having a 2-bar build. But if you're doing AoE stuff, putting Soul Tether on your front bar is going to work just as well. And that is it for our bar. Now let's go ahead and move on. We'll talk about gear, talk about traits on our gear, and then we'll move on to kind of the Mundus and all that other stuff, food and everything else. So I have 2 recommendations here. One is just for crafted and kind of overland, easy to get gear. And if you're going to do that, I recommend the crafted set Order's Wrath. This is from High Isle, one of the new areas. And then the other set I recommend is from Vardenfeld. It's called Warrior Maiden. Order's Wrath increases our critical strike damage and healing, and then War Maiden, what it does is increases our damage done with magic damage. It's kind of confusing because, you think most things that Magicka classes cast are magic damage. Actually, they're not. A lot of them are elemental types, and magic is its own damage type. Kind of needlessly confusing, but all the damage skills that we're going to do, if you may have noticed, they're all magic damage skills. And so you can use War Maiden to increase all of their damage. That's why this is a really niche set and only really works for Nightblades and to a lesser extent Templars. But War Maiden is an overland set. You can get it dropping off, chests in the area, delves, world bosses, or you can just go buy it also from a vendor. And so that could be really nice. You can just go buy it. It shouldn't be very expensive. It's very niche. That's old content. There should be plenty of War Maiden out there. So don't overspend for it, but War Maiden is a great set, and you can pair that with Order's Wrath. War Maiden is light, and then you can craft Order's Wrath in whatever weight you would like. And then for our monster set, I recommend for single target, I would recommend something like Zon. But for ease to grab, I would grab Stormfist. And the reason is it's a great AoE set right now, and it also is fairly easy to get compared to Zon. So Zon drops from Scalecaller Peak, and that's a much harder dungeon, and Stormfist drops from Dire Frost Keep, which is an older world dungeon and a lot easier to clear. So with the starter set, it works better. Now, if you're running group content, it's typically better to run 5 pieces of medium, and you're going to be okay running that with this build. You're going to be able to sustain that in group content. However, if you're running solo content or very unoptimized content, it's going to be much better to go with a full light setup. So recraft everything in light. And the reason for that, it'll give you a lot more mag recovery, which you'll really need if you're solo or if your group isn't optimized, so you're not getting resources back from everybody, from the different supports. And also it'll increase your penetration, which again, if you're doing solo content or if you're in unoptimized group content, you're going to need the extra penetration most likely. And that's the most important thing to get on any DPS build is to make sure that you're a penetration cap. If you're running around solo, you don't really need a source of major breach, because if you're running all light, you will lose a little bit of damage in optimized group content, but when you're first starting out, it's not that big of a deal. So just you can craft Order's Wrath in light or medium depending on what you think you need, are going to be using the most, or do one of each if you need to. For a more optimized setup here, we're going to go in with Pillar of Nirn, which is a medium set that drops from Falkrath Hold. And then we're going to pair that with a trial set. That's typically what you want to do. Trial sets have a 3-piece bonus, which gives increased damage by 5% in all group content or in any kind of instance content. And that's a huge deal. That 5% is a big deal, especially for like a 3-piece bonus. So we're going to go with World of Depths. That is a light set. Pillar of Nirn, like I said, is a medium set. And World of Depths drops to the new trial Dreadcell Reef, or at least the newest trial as the date of this video. I will note, if you want to use Arms of Reliquin, or just Reliquin as it's usually referred to, you could just swap that out with World of Depths and that would work just fine. I like World of the Depths because it's a lot easier to keep up, but on a Nightblade, you really need to be light attacking, so as long as you're on the same target, Arms of Reliquin is actually a pretty good set to run, and I would tend to recommend it more on a Nightblade than I would on some other classes, because on a Nightblade, it's already going to be so important that you hit all those light attacks that it's not that big of a deal. And then the monster set we're pairing with this is Zaan. This drops from Scalecaller Peak, as I mentioned. It's a little bit harder to clear that dungeon, and so even though it does a little bit more damage, that's why I was recommending Stormfist, but Zaan does the best single target damage. It is technically an AoE, it does damage in a line, but that's not as easy to proc and actually hit multiple targets with in content as you might think. So just keep that in mind. If you're in an AoE situation, you might want to go back to Stormfist. Now, a couple of quick notes about these sets. War Maiden, like I said, is an overland set, and you can get purple jewelry that just drops overland. Jewelry is extremely expensive to upgrade, so going and farming the purple jewelry yourself or buying it from a vendor is going to be a lot easier and cheaper than crafting Order's Wrath jewelry. So I do recommend that, and then you can just use transmutes. At least when you first start out, usually it's easier to get transmutes than it is to get purple and gold mats. So just kind of a pro tip there, but do whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. You can wear these anywhere. The only thing that matters is the weight on your body. And again, typically you want 5 medium for group content, or just go all light for solo content. Now let's talk about weapon traits and armor traits. So on the body, everything is divines. On the jewelry, we want to go with bloodthirsty on all of our jewelry, and then we want increased spell damage enchants. We're just doing a mag build setup, so that's why we're going with those choices there. For our weapons, if you're going to use daggers, you want to use Nirnhand in your main hand, and then a second dagger would be charged. If you want ranged, you want to go with a precise staff. And then for weapon enchants, again, on the dagger side, you could go with fire and then poison. With the precise staff, you can just go with poison for the most damage. I do recommend, honestly, if you're running around solo content, probably do a stam drain enchant, and that'll actually apply minor breach to an opponent when it procs, as well as giving you back a little bit of extra stamina. So if you're having a sprint or you're having a dodge roll around, hopefully you're not having to run too much because you already have major and minor expedition, but still the extra roll dodge, the extra stamina when you're in solo content and the breach can be helpful. And I don't think that a lot of people realize that those mag and stam drain enchants actually apply status effects. So it's kind of cool. All right, now for Mundus, we're going to go with the Thief Mundus. It increases our critical strike chance. That's just the best thing, gives the most damage, so that's why we're choosing that. We're going to put all of our points into Magicka because, again, this is just a Magicka build. Similarly, on the gear, we also want max Magicka enchants. If you get medium gear, it's going to drop with stamina enchants on it. You just need to trait those. I'll also note, and I try to say this in all my videos, you do not need perfected gear. Perfected gear gives you like 1% extra damage at the best case scenario. It's very, very small. So I don't recommend that you wait to get perfected gear. Go farm it on normal. Even trials are easy on normal, generally speaking. You only need a couple of experienced people and you can get through no problem. So it's better to go ahead and get the gear and even to gold it out, as long as it's not jewelry, before you go try to get a full set of perfected gear, especially when you're new. For food with this build, we're just going to go with something like Ghastly Eye Bowl. That'll give us max mag and max mag recovery, which we're going to need. If we're running around solo content or we need a little bit extra health, you could just go with something like Witch Mother's Potent Brew, which will give us max health, max mag, and then mag recovery. Just a little bit less of each of those things because it gives max health. With this build, you are going to want some sort of recovery, so I don't recommend just straight max mag food like we could on the Necromancer, so just keep that in mind. And then for our potion, we're just going to use spell power potions, and you want the one that gives you extra crit chance, extra spell power, and then gives you a bunch of magicka back and increases your magicka recovery by 20%. It's kind of weird in ESO. There's like these trash pots that are called spell power pots, and then there are the good ones that have the exact same name. They should 100% make some sort of distinction between these two, but you will see people try to cheat you out on the guild vendors with trying to sell one as the other. So just be careful. Make sure it gives you those 3 buffs. Make sure it's also max level, and they didn't make it with like a lower level kind of thing. There's things people do on accident sometimes. They just try to sell it, or maybe they're trying to scam people, but just keep an eye out. For race, I kind of always like dark elves, but since this is a magicka build, a high elf would also work very well. If you pick a class or a race that is really bad for a particular build, it's never going to be more than like 5% damage, so it's never going to be like totally game breaking. That is enough that you might consider trying to pick something that's optimal. But if you pick a class that has bonuses to max magicka and stuff like that, it's going to be not that big of a DPS loss. But again, high elf is going to be best, dark elf a close second. The reason I like dark elves is because you can also use them for stamina builds, so they're kind of the best of both worlds. A note about mythics here: if you want to run a mythic with this build, you'll get comparable damage, maybe even a little bit more. If you want to do that, you just drop your monster set and put on the mythic, and then put on 1 piece of crit damage, like Slime Crawl is the best thing to do there. But you totally don't need to do that. It was within the margin of error. Maybe you get 1,000 or 2,000 damage from doing that, but I couldn't even get a higher parse with the mythic than what I got on the dummy without one, so just keep that in mind. Now let's go ahead and talk about CP here. So this is fairly straightforward. We're going to go with Deadly Aim, Backstabber, or if you're in solo content where you can't get behind an opponent, or you're in Sunspire, you'll go with Fighting Finesse, and then Master of Arms, and Exploiter. Again, our Spamble will set opponents off balance, so Exploiters are a pretty safe thing to take for a Nightblade and something you can provide for the group. And then for our red CP, we have Fortified, Siphoning Spells if you're solo. You do need to get the Killing Blow for Siphoning Spells to proc. So again, you can make crazy, insane AoE build if you're just for like overland trash if you wanted to with a Nightblade by using Siphoning Spells. But if you're in group content, you know, somebody could steal that kill. And so you can kind of just use whatever else you want here. It's totally up to you. Expert Evasion gives you a free dodge roll. That's really nice. I've never, regretted having a free dodge roll. Rejuvenation just gives us a little bit more recovery, and so it's kind of the best thing to choose. Rejuvenation, I would note, is pretty much the only CP that I always want from the red tree. After that, you can kind of pick whatever you want. Fortified increases our armor, reduces our damage taken, but, just whatever you want from this. But it's just totally up to you. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about a parse here. So first thing you're going to do is pre-buff with our Merciless Resolve, and then we're going to drop our Trap because that's going to take a second and a half to arm. If you are running into combat, you can just run in. You can't pre-drop that, obviously, in all situations, unless you have the range morph, so just keep that in mind. And then we're going to use our Path. That'll give us 10% increased damage from our concealed weapon. And then at this point, we have all of our dots up. If we have the ultimate, we'll go ahead and use it, and then just use our Spamble for the next 6 seconds. If not, we just use our Spamble. Whenever we get 5 stacks for our bow proc, we'll go ahead and cast that. And then after that, it's just keeping up all of our dots. Whenever our Incapacitating Strike comes up, we make sure that our dots have about 6 seconds left on them, ideally, and then we cast that. When you're new, don't worry about that. Our Incapacitating Strikes, just cast it whenever we get the ultimate for it, and then it's just Spambles for the next 6 seconds, or our bow proc from Merciless Resolve. And then after that, if you have any dots that fell off, you can go ahead and refresh them. It's better not to cast Incapacitating Strike if you have like 1 second left on one of your dots. Go ahead and refresh the dot and then cast it, but it's not that big of a deal. And then when we get to 25% health, or actually just under, we're going to switch our Spamble and start using our Execute Spamble. Now, I was having a bit of problems sustaining. If that's you, or if you're in solo content, you want to make sure you're using a staff, because then you'll be able to heavy attack to get back Magicka, and then you just go back to using Merciless Resolve. And we want to make sure that we keep up all of our dots and our Merciless Resolve in Execute. Once we get to Execute, we don't actually use our bow procs anymore. We just use that passively for the increased weapon and spell damage. And again, just use our Execute spammable. So we keep up our Trap, we keep up our Merciless Resolve, we keep up our Path, and then it's just our Execute spammable during that phase. And that's it, guys. That's it for the Nightblade. As always, I hope this build was helpful. If you have any questions about anything, if you're struggling with a parse, you can always come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord. That's a mainly Trials Discord that I run, and the link is in my channel description, or you should be able to see it on the banner on the main page. We have a lot of people there that are very knowledgeable and are more than happy to help you out. And if you want to run trials, that's what we mostly do. So, come join us in a trial sometime. We always need raid leads, and we always have more people wanting to run trials than we have raid leads for them. It's a continual problem. I'm always trying to help teach new raid leads as much as I can. So I'm sorry if you come in there and you can't find a trial, but just know we still love to have you. We're trying to work on it. It's just a perpetual problem. Anyways, guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.